We're going to get into the second part here. Empire of Ideas. Ideas as weapons. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Steve Biko. Biko. Mm, Let me... Oh, I need to actually go to reading. Reading. No sound for you. No sound. Ideas are not separate from reality, hovering above it in a pristine realm of conceptual purity. They are devoted within particular concrete circumstances, and they result from specific theoretical practices, which themselves are an outgrowth of society's overall organization of intellectual production, as well as production more generally. In class societies, ideas are therefore suited, inevitably, in class struggle. This takes myriad and sundry forms, as we shall see, but the fundamental polarization of class society is a result of ownership. Those who possess and control the means of production also own and oversee the means of intellectual production. This gives them an incredible advantage in the battle of ideas, since they are the proprietors of the very system that manages the mindscape of the masses. The mindscape of the masses. I like that. He's quite poetic in the way he writes. It's too much. Okay. Capitalism has led to a greater concentration of wealth in the hands of an increasingly small minority, and this resulting polarization has only intensified in the monopoly and imperialist phase of capitalism. This socioeconomic reality makes actually existing capitalism, objectively speaking, more difficult to maintain, since it obviously does not and cannot serve the material interests of the overwhelming majority of the population and the planet. Hence, the importance of exercising, as much as possible, monopoly control over the world of ideas in the broadest sense of the term. Since the objective situation tilts in the direction of system change, at least in the big picture and without considering some of the countervailing tendencies, this can be corrected by creating subjective conditions via ideology that can lean in the opposite direction. Ideology is thus a crucial aspect of class struggle. Due to the degree of development of the imperialist system of ideological production and dissemination, which far surpasses anything seen before, ideology arguably exercises greater dominion over broad swaths of the population, imposes itself in massive quantities, abides by an accelerated rhythm of renewal, has been developed into ever more complex and sophisticated forms, is more centrally controlled, and increasingly reaches people in their intimate lives through the digital penetration of the private sphere. The battle against the dominant ideology is thus extremely difficult to wage, and the anti-imperialist forces have been obliged to fight like scrappy underdogs to get their message across wherever and however they can. Che famously set up Radio Rebelde in 1958 in the jungle of the Sierra Maestra in order to broadcast the aims of the July 26th movement. It went up against the juggernaut of an international system of cultural imperialism symbolized by Hollywood. This confrontation between the David of Radio Rebelde and the Goliath of Hollywood is precisely how the intellectual war has been fought out in reality. Those who own the means of production have used their stolen wealth to exercise near monopoly control over the means of communication, whereas the dispossessed of the world had to fight tooth and nail to develop their own systems of communication, to help spread their ideas and defend a fundamental proposition: a better world is possible. Contemporary Cuban intellectuals like Antonio Ramon Barrio Vasquez and Raul Antonio Capote have demonstrated how this battle is ultimately an all-encompassing cultural war. Drawing on government documents and personal experience, Capote worked for the CIA for 8 years while undercover for Cuban intelligence. They have brought into relief the totalizing nature of this war for hearts and minds, highlighting how central it has been for the US's specific version of empire building, particularly since the mid 20th century. In the words of Barrio uh, Vasquez, cultural war is a system that encompasses all levels of consciousness and activity of a given society. It mobilizes instruments and resources from any of the spheres of social life: political, moral, economic, juridical, judicial, judicial. Oh, I do know, I do know English. I do know the
Juridical.
juridical, juridical.
Juridical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, juridical, juridical. Of or relating to the administration of justice, or the office of a judge. Of or relating to law or Jewish jurisprudence. Okay. Juridical. Noted. Uh, I have to start over from the other page. God damn it. Okay. It mobilizes instruments and resources from any of the spheres of social life: political, moral, economic, juridical, scientific, artistic, aesthetic, and others. It carries out public actions and, of course, maintains covert operations. They try, by all means, to exercise control over information, public opinion, tastes, preferences, feelings, to extend their power over education, promotion, and diffusion, to favor behaviors of submission, passivity, and demobilization, or of indiscipline and aggressiveness, which, together with the replacement and substitution of values, with the creation of other false ones, guarantee to secure domination and imperial hegemony. As diverse and totalizing as it was, uh, sorry, as it is, fuck, I'm starting over. Words. As diverse and totalizing as it is, the cultural war is nonetheless organized around a fundamental objective, namely, to achieve the political goal of advancing imperialism and destroying its principal impediment, socialism. Invisible Empire. In 1964, the US journalist Lisa Howard did an interview with Ernesto Che Guevara for a major outlet of imperial disinformation, ABC News. She asked him, "It has appeared to us, of viewing the Cuban scene, that two of your chief problems are this difficulty disciplining the people to a communist state and a kind of strangling bureaucracy. Do you feel these are two great problems?" After confirming that she was asking about Cuba's problems, he replied with a serious demeanor, "Our two main problems are—" Che's face suddenly lit up with a broad smile as he counted on his fingertips for emphasis: imperialism and imperialism. The shade. The shade. The absolute aura of this man. The United States is, and always has been, an empire. From its very beginning as a settler colony on the eastern seaboard until today, it has been constantly expanding. As historian Daniel Immerwahr demonstrated in How to Hide an Empire, The logo map image of 48 contiguous states, which most people have in mind when they think of the United States, was only a reality for 3 years of its existence. It continued to acquire overseas territories and has, today, ringed the globe with some 800 military bases, which is likely more than any other people, nation, or empire in history. This is, of course, only the geographic and military footprint of the empire. But much the same could be said of its economic, political, social, cultural, and intellectual dominion. Goodness. Sorry, Chad. Not the ad censoring, Rockhill. Save your fellow chatters if you can. The United States is an empire, however, of a peculiar sort. It has a unique tradition of denying its own existence. This custom is certainly not the only one, since there is also a lineage of explicit imperialists, but it has deep historical roots. These are visible, for instance, in its self-description as a democracy and a land of the free, liberated from the stranglehold of the British Empire, when it was actually established as an anti-democratic republic, meaning oligarchy, founded on a violent war of aggression and dispossession against the working class, characterized by colonization, indigenous genocide, chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and domestic slavery. What is remarkable, though, about this U.S. tradition of empire denial is that it has tended to become predominant in precisely this time period when the United States came to exert itself in the world's leading imperialist power. Assert itself as the world's leading imperialist power. This occurred during the wake of what Domenico Lucerto calls the 30 Years' War, meaning the conflagration of inter-imperialist rivalry that lasted from roughly the early to mid 20th century. As the United States emerged from this extended conflict as the primary empire of the world, it emphatically denied its imperial status, and it relied heavily on neocolonialism and clandestine operations to do so. One of the principal reasons for this is that its imperial expansion was held in check by the USSR, which not only supported anti imperialist struggles, but also engaged in the war of information to reveal the truth behind US machinations around the world. Another important reason is that the United States, in wresting lands from the former imperialist powers, often presented itself as a liberator from empire rather than a new imperial overlord, which proved useful in mobilizing certain segments of the local population on its behalf, as well as garnering support for imperialism on the home front. The preferred solution has thus been to have imperial expansion go hand in hand with imperial denial, while propagandistically depicting the USSR as the real empire that coincidentally needed to be overthrown. Under the banner of democracy, freedom, and human rights, the United States has thereby extended its dominion over large swaths of the world, presenting itself as a benevolent benefactor rather than a domineering despot. It has, in this way, perfected the use of empire denial as the best cover for the construction of its imperium. In order to do this, it has developed the most powerful, far reaching, and centrally controlled cultural apparatus in the history of humanity, which it has imposed, as much as possible, on the entire world through cultural imperialism. This apparatus is compromised, composed, sorry. This apparatus is composed of an expansive system of cultural production, circulation, and consumption, and it forms a key component of the superstructure. It not only encompasses culture in the restricted sense of the arts and entertainment, but it also includes so-called news and information, the world of professional intelligentsia, sports, digital culture, social media, and the entire realm of industrial produced or mediated culture in the broadest sense of the term. U.S. imperial expansion has thus been accompanied every step of the way by the construction of a cultural empire whose power and reach far outstrips such earlier endeavors due to the level of development of its ideological system. It is capable of magically transforming imperial vices into democratic virtues, at least in the hearts and minds of some of its consumers. These must be trained, however, not to perceive the entire process. One of the most important psychological wars is thus the battle to hide propaganda itself by passing it off as something else, such as journalism, academic scholarship, culture, art, or simply entertainment. Such as Shen Yun. Shen Yun does this. It does anti-communist propaganda via uh, theater. This process of dissimulation also applies to cultural imperialism itself, which the US cultural apparatus generally describes as freedom of the press and media, as well as artistic, cultural, and intellectual liberty. What this so called freedom actually means is that those who own the cultural apparatus are free to impose it everywhere in the world, and those who do not are free to consume it as much as possible. The US Imperium can thereby also fight wars for people's freedom to be systematically indoctrinated by the cultural empire, as it has regularly done against Cuba and generally against any country that lays claim to its own cultural sovereignty, meaning its right not to be the victim of imperial propaganda. Yes, like China. An actually existing impediment to empire. The national liberation of a people is the regaining of the historical personality of that people, its return to history through the destruction of the imperialist domination to which it was subjected. Amilcar Cabral. The greatest obstacle to imperial expansion has been actually existing socialism, which breaks the chains of empire in the name of defending the rights of the peoples of this world to self-determination. Although the United States imperial dream machine is deeply invested in power projection, and many assume that the leading imperialist country has been undisputed world leader for quite some time. Uh, sorry. Oh no. The fucking he does he does do the run-on sentence a bit. He does a bit of run-on. It's okay. It's fine. I'll start over. It's I can do this. Although the United States' imperial dream machine is deeply invested in power projection, and many assume that the leading imperialist country has been the undisputed world leader for quite some time, it is crucially important to recognize, as analysts like Radhika Desai have emphasized, that it has never truly exercised global dominion. Shout out Radhika Desai. As a matter of fact, the United States took over the helm of imperialism at a moment of major losses and retreats. By imperialism in this context, I mean what Amilcar Cabral referred to as a worldwide expression of the search for profits and the ever increasing accumulation of surplus value by monopoly financial capital centered in two parts of the world. first in Europe and then in North America. At the close of the Second World War, imperialism faced a powerful adversary that had just done what many in the imperial core considered to be impossible. It rooted out the Nazi war machine and was the principal force responsible for liberating Europe from fascism. The Soviet Union helped break, moreover, many of the chains of imperialism and expand the socialist world. Between the official end of the Second World War and the early 1980s, the movements of anti-colonial liberation spread socialism across many countries in the global south, and numerous non-socialist or semi-socialist projects of national self-determination also blossomed. By 1950, around one-third of the global population was living under a self-declared socialist government. In 1959, with the Cuban Revolution, revolutionary socialism arrived in the Western Hemisphere, liberating an island that is literally on the doorstep of the U.S. empire. In the big picture, and despite endless wars to try to prove the contrary, imperialism was on the retreat during the first phase of U.S. leadership. The neoliberal conjecture, sorry, no, the neoliberal conjuncture of counter-revolution did turn the tide, and the destruction of the Warsaw Pact countries was a major setback for the socialist camp. Oh. Excuse me. However, the United States has still failed to definitively decapitate the many-headed hydra of anti-imperialist resistance, and the global socialist movement more specifically. In the current conjuncture, there are many signs that the counter-revolutionary wave is cresting, at least in the sense that the imperial power of the United States is not what it once was. The world is looking increasingly multipolar, and the rise of China as a self-declared socialist country is one sign among many that the imperial dominion of the United States is still held in check. The war against communism has thus been coextensive with the fight for imperialism. While the waging of the first battle has sometimes been open, at least for a few of the fronts of struggle, the second has frequently been disguised, even though they are ultimately the same war. The Empire of Ideas has been tasked with providing cover for the brutality of imperial warfare, while denigrating its enemies, the anti-imperialists, as the true monsters seeking global domination. The battle to turn the world upside down and capture hearts and minds for the imperial project thus constitutes one of the most fundamental features of U.S. imperium. To bring this clearly into view, consider a fact highlighted by William Blum, namely that only one country in the world has, since the Second World War, endeavored to overthrow more than 50 governments, most of whom were democratically elected, grossly interfered with democratic elections in at least 30 countries, attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders, some, such as Fidel Castro, multiple times, dropped bombs on people of more than 30 countries, attempted to suppress a populist or nationalist movement in 20 countries. Huh. What country could that be? Do you, do you know what country? David Michael Smith calculated that the same country has been responsible or shared responsibility for the deaths of some 54 million people in its wars abroad between 1945 and 2020. If we add domestic social murder to the equation, and open up the timescale to include the entire history of what Smith calls the endless holocausts of the U.S. empire, the number is close to 300 million deaths. Based on these brute facts, Blums are 10 years old and would need to be updated. Most people would easily recognize this country for what it is: the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Many, however, do not share this view, and for one principal reason. This same country, the United States, has developed an incredibly powerful empire of ideas to hide, obscure, and deny these facts. In other words, it is also the greatest purveyor of intellectual war in the contemporary world. What Che and his comrades represented was an actually existing impediment to empire. They leveraged one of its prized colonial possessions, which had served as a center for gambling, prostitution, the drug trade, agricultural extractivism, and tourism, away from the Yankees, and they put it back in the hands of the Cubans. This is why they needed it to be destroyed. And this is why the U.S. war on Cuba and its crippling illegal blockade have continued unabated. Whatever problems might occur within socialist countries, it should never be forgotten that they emerged out of and within a capitalist world intent on crushing them by any means necessary because of what they represent: an alternative to imperialism. Oh, it's so good. This is so good. War of Ideas. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Edward Bernays. This book, like the two volumes that will follow it, focuses on a specific aspect of the War of Ideas by concentrating on the capitalist ruling class's failed attempt to destroy its nemesis, communism. The story of Che's Head, recounted above, provides, in microcosm, an overview of the fundamental issues at play in the macrocosm of this international class struggle, in theory. It thereby provides a concise summary of some of the key themes of the analysis that follows. Imperial war goes hand in hand with ideological warfare. The battle for hearts and minds has multiple facets. It can serve to prepare for imperialist expansion, provide cover for repressive violence, manage the historical narrative, and much more. The intelligentsia, including journalists, writers, artists, pundits, and professors, plays a major role in psychological warfare, and thus class struggle in theory. The ideas that have been the most denigrated by empire, particularly communism, are those that are the most dangerous to it, whereas the ideas that have been the most promoted are those that serve imperial interests in various ways, sometimes indirectly. Bourgeois culture seeks to domesticate and use for its own purposes whatever dangerous ideas it cannot destroy or control outright. The bourgeois democratic state, though it seeks to project an image of itself as a neutral guarantor of individual rights, works in the service of the bourgeoisie, whose bidding it does through both overt government and covert means, intelligence services. The relationship between a major corporation like United Fruit and a state agency like the CIA reveals the fundamental pattern regarding how the capitalist ruling class relates to its state, captured by the correct acronym Capitalism's Imperial Agency, CIA. The war of anti-imperialist liberation is very much a material struggle, but it is also an ideological one. theory, at some level, is engaged in class struggle, but ideas take on real transformative power when they grip the masses and are acted upon through organized politics. Anti-imperialist state building projects that develop sorry, no, anti-imperialist state building projects that develop socialism in the real world are the principal means of fighting imperialism. This this bullet list is it's you could, this could be like a thesis, but like he just gets to it. He gets to it in the into it in the he's so good at words. Goodness. The study focuses on a specific aspect of the Psy War on communism by concentrating on the intellectual war fought out among the professional intelligentsia. As witnessed in the case of Che, this battle is multifaceted, and it is by no means the product of mechanical causes. The approach in this investigation is dialectical, in the sense that it analyzes the nuances and complexities of this conflict as a many-sided phenomenon, emphasizing all the different forms of agency at work. This includes, crucially, the political economy of knowledge, but not in a crassly reductivist sense. Rather than hypostasizing a superstructure and correlating it rather abstractly to an equally reified infrastructure, it examines the complex and fine-grained relationship between socioeconomic forces, on the one hand, and ideological production and dissemination on the other, while elucidating how dialectically enmeshed they are. I just need to sit with this for a second. Uh, okay, first, I don't know what this word is. Hy, hyp, hypo, hypostasi, help. Where was it? Hypost. To attribute real identity to a concept. Hypostasize.
Hypostatize. Hypostatize.
Hypostatize. Hypostatize. Complex and fine-grained relationship between socioeconomic forces and ideological production and dissemination. Okay. 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 I got it. Noted. This is not done, however, to shore up the Western Marxist thesis regarding the primacy of the ideological, but rather to demonstrate that these socioeconomic conditions, in the macroscopic sense, are ultimately the primary driving forces, but they do not mechanically determine ideology. It is therefore important to be attuned from the outset to the complex nature of the activities undertaken in the intellectual world war within the professional intelligentsia. Communism sounds good in theory, but fails in practice. Wrong. So wrong. There's a lot of cases of it working. It is therefore important. Wait, no, I said this. These range from the pace of academically laundering state propaganda to the funding of publications and conferences, the establishment of research institutions and international knowledge networks, providing grants for particular projects, hiring the theoreticians, wittingly or unwittingly, for certain tasks, promoting and translating the work of collaborationist intellectuals, and much more. It is essential to recognize in this regard, sorry, how deeply Western intelligence services are involved in psychological warfare, which goes a long way in explaining why so many intellectuals have ties to them. The thinkers who have participated in these Psywar projects have played many different roles, and they have exercised their agency rather than somehow being rigorously determined in their thoughts and actions. Some of them have worked for the U.S. national security state, such as Sidney Hook and James Burnham, who were both prominent philosophy professors at the New York University, at New York University, employed by the CIA. Wow. The same is true for most of the members of the Frankfurt School hired in Washington, who worked for the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's predecessor organization, the State Department, and propaganda agencies like the Office of War Information, OWI, and Voice of America. Let us consider a few other examples which illustrate one of the important but underanalyzed features of intellectual life in the imperial core, namely the sheer number of major figures who collaborated in various and sundry ways with imperial intelligence services, and whose careers certainly benefited from this. The liberal feminist icon Gloria Steinem worked as an agent of the CIA for at least 4 years. When this was revealed by Ramparts, she defended herself by claiming that the agency's people were enlightened, liberal, nonpartisan activists. If I had the choice, she added, I would do it again. Wow. She had found in the CIA powerful allies for promoting the diversity of our government's ideas over and against communism. Seinem's close collaboration with Cywar Supremo and Time Inc. executive C.D. Jackson, who worked closely with the CIA, surely helped bolster her career as the face of U.S. feminism, thereby shoring up liberal and corporate approaches to gender and sexual relations over and against socialist feminism. The well-known anarchist political scientist James C. Scott also frankly admitted that he was recruited to the CIA when he went to Burma on a Rotary Fellowship, where he wrote reports for the agency on the local political situation. The anti-state radical then continued his sub rosa work for the deep state when his CIA contracts, arranged through the National Student Association, which they controlled, to have him go to Paris for a year and be an overseas representative. As the international vice president of the National Student Association, he was, in his own words, a CIA agent. Although he boldly claimed, in strict anarchist fashion, that when the revolution becomes the state, it becomes my enemy again. Scott neglected to add that the most powerful state, which was an enemy of all revolutions, also happened to be his secret friend. Curious. Curious. To take a final example, one of the leading intellectuals affiliated with world systems analysis, Emanuel Wallerstein, served in the U.S. Army during the Korean War from 1951 to 53, and then began working in non-communist international student organizations. He even became vice president of the World Assembly of Youth, WAY, a confederation of 51 youth groups from Western and non-communist countries that served to counter the World Federation of Democratic Youth, WFDY, headquartered in Warsaw. WAY was financially precarious until the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs, FYSA, became a major contributor. Bernice Bridges also, Bernice Bridges wrote to Wallerstein to express her concern about FYSA's outside contribution and that the WFDY could now prove their charges about American control. It is not clear what Wallerstein responded. However, about a decade later, the real source behind this foundation was revealed: the CIA. In fact, the 1967 former CIA officer Thomas W. Braden disclosed that the agency had placed one of its men in the organization, which was also deeply penetrated by French intelligence. It is interesting to note that Wallerstein avoided any direct mention of this in his autobiographical introduction to The Essential Wallerstein, and I am not aware of any public statement he has made about serving as one of the leaders of an anti-communist student organization funded by the CIA and penetrated by Western intelligence services. However, as his fellow student activist Rene Wadlow pointed out, Wellerstein maintained connections with members of these organizations, such as Andrei Schriffen, who later established the New Press and published many of Wallerstein's books. There was a real consensus between the American executive and the youth leaders of that time, according to Joel Kotek, and many of them later pursued academic careers, like Wallerstein, to choose or or chose to work for the CIA or one of its subsidiaries. The famous Columbia and Yale professor, for his part, made an international career in knowledge networks bound up with the intellectual world war on communism. Many other cases could be cited. Collaboration with powerful state agencies often accompanies, like a shadow, intellectual fame in the capitalist world. This is not only the case for right-wing thinkers, but also, as we have just seen, for leftists subservient to an anti-communist dogma, such as the liberal, the anarchist, and the eclectic Western Marxist just mentioned. These are all positions that the CIA identified as part of the compatible or respectable left, meaning the left that was compatible with capitalism, and respectable because it condemned communism. The agency promoted this non-communist left from behind the scenes, precisely because it was one of the best ways of fragmenting the left, and most importantly, waging an all-out war on the incompatible left of the communists. To be clear, connections to this project do not, in and of themselves, invalidate the entirety of a scholar's contributions. These need to be assessed dialectically through a nuanced process of interpretation that distinguishes useful developments from ideologically compromised positions. Wallerstein, for example, has done some important work, which will be referenced in the pages that follow. In undertaking a dialectical analysis of intellectual collaboration, it is essential to avoid focusing narrowly on particular agencies, such as the CIA, and instead construct a comprehensive understanding of the social totality, encompassing various state agencies, non-governmental organizations, and corporate soft power initiatives. An intellectual did not have to collaborate directly with the CIA to play a role in the intellectual world war on communism. The world-famous anthropologist Margaret Mead, for instance, served as a State Department consultant and secured funding from the Air Force's new think tank, the RAND Corporation, to set up a Studies in Soviet Culture project. Ernesto Laclau, a towering figure in a post-Marxist critical theory, was employed as a researcher in the Ford Foundation's Proyecto Marginality project. According to Nestor Cohan's insightful analysis, which draws on Daniel Hopin's exacting scholarship. This 1960s project sought to identify what would happen to the sectors of the working class that would become unemployed and marginalized. The imperialists were thereby preparing for neoliberal shock therapy that would begin in earnest in Chile after the CIA's 1973 coup d'etat, and they wanted to understand the possible reactions in order to develop counterinsurgency plans. Everyone knew, according to Gohan, that behind Ford stood the world's leading counterinsurgency institution, the CIA. Moreover, collaboration comes in many forms, and it is important to be attentive to what we might call the concentric circles of collaboration. If the inner circle consists in direct witting employment, followed by another tight ring of unwitting work serving the same purpose, there are many other orbits which often interact with one another. Some intellectuals, some intellectuals were directly involved in anti-communist subversion campaigns, but were not, as far as we know, in the direct employ of intelligence services like the CIA. This was the case for major figures like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Slavoj Žižek, who committed themselves, in very practical terms, to the overthrow of communism. Other professors collaborated with the knowledge networks supported by the ruling class, and sometimes clandestinely, government agencies, thereby owing a portion of their fame to promotion by the bourgeoisie and its men and women of the shadows. Theodor Adorno, Hannah Arendt, Raymond Aron, Max Horkheimer, and countless others, but of course to varying degrees. As Frances Stoner Saunders asserted in her path-breaking study of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF, whether they liked it or not, whether they knew it or not, there were few writers, poets, artists, historians, scientists, or critics in post-war Europe whose names were not in some way linked to this covert enterprise. Many intellectuals have developed their work in what they consider to be an autonomous fashion and do not have clear connections to the networks just mentioned. However, they tend to ignore or downplay the fact that, materially speaking, they are working within systems of knowledge ultimately controlled by the bourgeoisie. So their advancement within them largely depends on how much their intellectual labor segues with the interests of the owners of the means of intellectual production. This is the real meritocracy. These nuances will be spelled out through the course of this analysis, but it is important to insist at the outset on a dialectical approach to intellectual collaboration in order to preempt crude and reductivist interpretations of the study that follows. This book, like its companion volumes, is most definitively not advancing a simplistic and reductive argument that the intelligentsia have been remote controlled by the CIA, or that there is a centralized theoretical conspiracy that explains every aspect of intellectual history. On the contrary, by examining the material reality of the intellectual production dialectically, it brings to the fore the intricate complexities of social relations with all of the various types of agency at work, which are never stagnant or isolated, but are rather interrelated as processes situated within the social totality. Doctrinal warfare. Doctrinal ideological warfare is, or should be, a central factor in our psychological warfare. It exposes the basic vulnerabilities of the hostile systems and exploits the beneficial or favorable aspects of one's own system to persuade people away from the former and to adopt rational solutions. It should be it should provide the foundation on which effective propaganda could be based. This is a memo for the Doctrinal Ideological Warfare Panel of the Psychological Strategy Board, PSB. Sorry, I keep coughing, chat. Sorry. The War of Ideas is not simply a battle over particular notions or specific issues. As clearly outlined in internal documents from the early Cold War, it is, at the highest level, a question of doctrinal warfare. This expression is used to refer to the fight to control people's overall ideological worldview or doctrine, meaning the general framework within specific ideas are situated. The Psy Warriors of the US national security state recognized how important this is because if you are able to consolidate an ideological gestalt, then any particular experience will be mediated by it, including ones that appear to contradict it. In this way, apparent exceptions are interpreted via an all-encompassing ideological paradigm, which, if the doctrinal warfare is successful, remains unshakable, in spite of the potential countervailing evidence. This resilience stems from the role of ideological doctrine in interpreting the totality of experience, allowing anomalies to be rationalized or dismissed without undermining the core system of belief. Doctrinal warfare thereby serves to fortify a foundational ideological worldview that remains impervious to empirical contradictions. This approach to the war of ideas was clearly outlined by the U.S. Psychological Strategy Board, PSB, which was established in 1951 and tasked with the formulation and promulgation as guidance to the departments and agencies responsible for psychological operations of overall national psychological objectives, policies, and programs, and for the coordination and evaluation of the national psychological effort. Composed of agency directors, the PSB reported to the National Security Council, NSC. In its June 29, 1953 report on the U.S. doctrinal program, it explained that the goal of the PSB was to provide permanent literature and foster long-term intellectual movements, which will appeal to intellectuals, including scholars and opinion-forming groups. It explicitly recognized that the target audience for doctrinal warfare is the professional intelligentsia. The logic is simple. Because it manages the minds of the masses through the media, education, religious organizations, civic associations, etc., the intelligentsia, if correctly trained, can establish and consolidate an ideological doctrine among the general population. Part of this project was negative, and internal documents clearly spell out the importance of an intellectual world war on communism as the rival doctrine to be broken down and ideally eliminated. Indeed, there are long and detailed PSB documents that provide point-by-point refutations of major communist themes, which served as guidelines for the intelligentsia. At the same time, the other principal objective of doctrinal warfare is to foster a worldwide understanding and sympathetic acceptance of the traditions and viewpoints of America and the free world. Capital F, capital W. Free world. In its studies, the PSB found the negative doctrinal warfare was much less effective if it was not combined with the positive battle for hearts and minds that sought to consolidate a belief in the superiority of the, quote, free world, unquote. One of the most intriguing and strategically significant tactics is that is encouraged, which is essential to understand for a complete picture of the history of Western Marxism, consists in a subtle, soft sell campaign against communism. Rather than systematically attacking everything to do with Marxism and communism, the PSB recognized that it was preferable, at least in certain cases, to foster the development of a form of Marxism that could serve as a tool for both criticizing communism and defending the so-called free world. A PSB memorandum on ideological warfare, therefore, explicitly recommends two tasks that might sound surprising to those who assumed the US government was crudely anti-communist across the board. Attacks on communist ideology developed in Marxist terms, and defense of Western society in Marxist terms. In both cases, the objective was to mobilize Marxism to assail communism and defend the capitalist world. By putting Marxism itself in the service of doctrinal warfare, intellectuals convinced by Marxist theory were thereby encouraged to hold on to a purportedly authentic version of Marxism, while using it to vilify Marxism in practice, and, at a minimum, accommodate capitalism. Typical. It is revealing that both tasks were taken up in earnest by Western Marxists of various stripes. Some of them had direct ties to the US national security state, and others simply operated within the imperial intellectual system of knowledge, generally receiving uplift for their ideological alignment on the dominant doctrine. Sorry. Among those who worked for the bourgeois state, Herbert Marcuse stands out as a particularly revealing case, as we will see in detail, because he was not simply one of the Western Marxists who took up the torch of the anti-communist Marxism that was being covertly promoted by government agencies like the PSB. Rather than being a target of doctrinal warfare, he was one of its perpetrators. The PSB used the memoranda of Marcuse's CWC, Committee on the World Communism in the State Department, as one of the most important sources of information. Unlike short-term propaganda campaigns, then, doctrinal warfare is a long-term battle to shore up the ideology of the intelligentsia, thereby guaranteeing that the rest of the population will be constantly exposed to the same fundamental worldview. If all the experts agree on the fundamentals, despite any minor disagreements, it sends the message that their consensus is based on objective reality rather than being driven by an ideological agenda. In order to be effective, doctrinal warfare cannot be intermittent, but instead requires the development of three interlocking projects, according to the PSB. 1. Long-range plans for the production and distribution of intellectual materials for the direction of activities aimed separately and concurrently at appealing to intellectuals, including scholars and opinion-forming groups. 2. Provocative and stimulating doctrinal materials which critically and effectively analyze communist doctrines, as well as those objectively setting forth the viewpoints of America and the free world. 3. Improved distribution mechanisms for the permanent literature, not only American, but also foreign materials. Successful doctrinal warfare, therefore, necessitates a powerful material system of ideological production, distribution, and consumption that constantly and consistently communicates the appeal of the dominant ideology, while criticizing its rival through provocative and stimulating materials. The massive industry of The anti-Cuban ideological production and dissemination would be one example of how doctrinal warfare works, as long as it is understood as part of a much larger anti-communist war that seeks to shore up the doctrinal belief in the superiority of the supposed free world. That is, the one intent on destroying Cuba's freedom. You cannot kill ideas that fight back. The upside down world teaches us to suffer reality instead of changing it, to forget the past instead of listening to it, and to accept the future instead of imagining it. That is how it practices crime, and that is how it recommends it. In its school, the school of crime, the class of impotence, amnesia, and resignation are obligatory. But it is clear that there is no misfortune without fortune, nor a side that does not have a flip side, nor discouragement that does not seek its encouragement, nor is there a school that does not encounter its counter school. Eduardo Galeano. Welcome in, Rosamare. Thank you. The intellectual world war is an endeavor to turn the world war upside down by presenting imperial expansion as democracy promotion and counter-revolutionary violence as the struggle for freedom, while simultaneously slandering anti-imperialist state-building projects grounded in democratic self-determination as part of any evil empire. The imperial forces have the most powerful cultural apparatus in the history of the world on their side. Yet they have been incapable of killing an idea, in the broad sense of a general ideological worldview, that has meant so much to so many people around the world who are struggling for liberation and to save the planet from capitalist liquidation. They have also failed to crush the autonomous systems of cultural production built up by the anti-imperialist camp, the counter school mentioned by Galeano, in an effort to spread this idea and mobilize it for a material project of social transformation. Thomas Sankara, sometimes referred to as the Che of Africa, gave a speech in 1987 at the inauguration of an exhibition honoring the life of the great revolutionary. Titled "You Cannot Kill Ideas," Sankara asserted that, for us, Che Guevara is not dead. He was alive in Burkina Faso, and Africa more generally, because some of his ideas live in each of us in the daily struggle we wage. Che's revolutionary conviction, his sense of humanity, and his demanding character that forced him to make the common cause with the people, all of these were operative in the Burkinabe Revolutionary Project. The same is true, more generally, of his resolute anti-imperialism, his defense of self-determination, his dedication to building socialism, and his use of dialectical and historical materialism as the most powerful weapon of class struggle. A week after this speech, Sankara's revolutionary government was overthrown and he was assassinated, revealing once again that the intellectual world war was not simply theoretical. It is a fight for the kind of world that we want to live in, a battle for the very nature of reality and what we think is possible. It is a conflict that positions us all and forces us to take sides. Are we with the imperialists, reaping material rewards for trampling on others? Or do we make common cause with the anti-imperialists, who seek to uplift the lives of all? Whose ideas do we want to carry forth in the world and embody in material reality through our struggles? Those of the liberators who have strived under dire circumstances and constant onslaught to make the idea of a better world into a material reality, or those who have sought to stop the socialist project in its tracks, by not only killing its leaders, but also attempting to destroy the very idea they embody. That's it. That's the chapter. Next, we've got Introduction to the Intellectual World War.